I am so happy to introduce this event. It's our third event on the PPV platform, which we called Occupy PPV. Why it's called so? Because the PPV platform, Perverting the Power Vertical, was convened a couple of years ago by a group of academics in the UCL. And now in this term, my name is Dasha Musova, me and other Ukrainian activists, we kind of occupied this platform to center Ukrainian voices, but mostly anti-authoritarian and anti-fascist voices, speaking about art, culture, architecture, activism, and beyond that. And this is our third event, which we are really excited about because this is something we are not specialists in, and that's why we invited great people whose work we admire, and we want to learn a lot about their ideas and really want to share their thoughts on anti-fascism and anti-fascist architecture with you. And I'll pass my words to Vlada to introduce the speakers for today.
So hi everyone, I'm just going to go through the wonderful speaker list we have. And first off, we have Aniela Dumonjic. And Aniela is a Bosnian activist, architecture, photographer, artist, and researcher. Dumonjic has obtained her Bachelor of Arts in Architecture at the Technical University of Munich, and she's currently enrolled in the Joint Master's Program for Southeastern European Studies in Track of Politics and Law at the University of Graz in Austria. Her work currently aims at interweaving ex-Yugoslavian socialist material heritage with current oppressive societal and political structures. Other fields of her research are memory, trauma, transnational gender and decolonial studies, as well as identity politics, which in contemporary culture pose the central core for any action and resonate with diasporic difficulties of self-contextualization. Then we have Daniel Jonas Rocha with us from Keene University School of Public Architecture, and sorry if I butchered that, Dan. Dan is an adjunct professor of architecture, curator, and writer in New York City. Originally from Boston, his research focuses include socialist art and architecture and US labor history. His forthcoming book is entitled The Sloanist City, Alfred Sloan, Post-Fordism and American Apartheid, publishing with Dom Publishers in Berlin. His academic writings have been published by Princeton University, Rice University, and include forthcoming publications with the University of Puerto Rico and the MIT School of Architecture. He contributes to the Architects newspaper and New York Review of Architecture and is currently a lecturer at Keene University School of Public Architecture. And last but not least, we have Andrew Santa Lucia. And Andrew is a Cuban-American designer, educator, and prison abolitionist based in Portland, Oregon. He's an assistant professor of practice at Portland State's University School of Architecture, where he teaches design studio, history, theory, criticism seminars, and is graduate thesis coordinator. He has lectured and exhibited internationally, including Art Basel, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and the Venice Biennial of Architecture. Andrew's writings can be found in a broad range of media, from academic journals to DIY zines. He runs Office Andorus, which designs architecture for activists, public institutions, and private clients with the goal of influencing public perceptions through works of architecture. His work is a hybrid of bold colors, graphics, and shapes used to translate and amplify contemporary issues of social justice through aesthetics. And just by the way, the image that we used for this event is one of Andrew's work, maybe that Andrew will talk about later on, who knows? And it's called Alter to Anti-Fascist Architecture. And before going into the presentations, like Dasha has pointed out already, in PPV, we're interested in all things anti-fascist, and we feel like architecture is a very important field to be having this discussion in. So we're very excited for this talk, and we hope that all of you will contribute in your own way, and I guess we can start off. Thank you.
Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dasha and Vlada. We're super happy to be here. We thoroughly believe in what PPV is doing, and yeah, I'm going to get into it and share my screen. Can everybody see what I'm looking at? Cool. So to start off, I wanted to start with a very personal anecdote that's kind of been haunting me since architecture school. I finished my undergraduate degree in architecture between 2011 and 2015. And during that time, in my history and theory courses, I was exposed to a wide variety of projects, 99% of them from the United States and Western Europe. And one of the most disturbing projects that I was introduced to during this time was this building that we're looking at here called House of the Fascists, Casa del Fascio in Como, Italy, by Giuseppe Terrani. I remember it was my second year of architecture school, in my fourth history class, when a history professor told me that this was a great building that I really needed to learn. And so that day in history class, we spent 2 hours diagramming and sketching every single facade on the building. And this was, I was in a seminar with about 100 other people, and I did the exercise, but inside it was a particularly painful experience for me, as somebody who is Jewish, somebody who's lost I don't know how many relatives to fascism. I remember being in my chair in architecture school, sketching this building, and then I was having these kind of painful, intrusive thoughts almost every year at Passover, my family and I we'd look at photos of family members who died in the Holocaust. And so I just remember I had these penetrating memories. And so it was a horribly kind of painful experience that I think a lot of people who may have entered architecture school in the West have had to endure. And so when we were learning about this building, this wasn't the photo that was shown on the projector. It was the previous photo where, it's a group of architecture students looking at the building up from the outside on a nice sunny Italian day. But in the 1940s, if you walked by this building, this is what it would have looked like. A massive deity, kind of idolatry to Mussolini with the swastika and so forth. And so I remember coming home from class that day, and I found this photo, and I kind of said to myself, what the fuck? What's going on here? So this photo here is just a small commemorative memorial from the shtetl that my family is from, called Shklov, which was built to commemorate the lives of the 12,000 Jews who were executed and placed in mass graves. And so for me, I just couldn't process why I was being exposed to this building and why I was being told it was a great building. And so the question that I want to introduce before I start my lecture is, what kind of sick and twisted discipline teaches this building to 19-year-olds? So the title of my talk today is White Artists and Architects in the Global West Have Always Worshipped Fascism. My name is Dan Jonas-Roche. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how artists and architects, white artists and architects in the Global West, when not benefiting directly from fascism, they tend to overlook the fascists that they work for. So I'm going to throw some haymakers at Dali, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Philip Johnson, Peter Eisenman, and many, many more, because this list goes on and on. So the first person that I'd like to indict is Salvador Dali, of course, one of the 20th century's most prolific artists. Today, I think if Dali was around, he would probably be one of the kind of edgelords on the politogram, kind of reciting Alexander Dugin or something like that. But so this is a quote from Salvador Dali that he said to a poet in the 1960s at a Paris cafe. For me, the greatest artist surrealist is Adolf Hitler. And he was just kind of saying it to incite emotion from the other person. But for me, that kind of says a lot, just that how you can say this almost as like a joke, if not completely serious. And so another person who didn't hide his kind of fascist sympathies was Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, I'm just going to read some quotes of his. If he is serious about his announcements, Hitler can crown his life with the great work, the reshaping of Europe. Another quote. The Druze are having a hard time now. I'm sometimes contrite about it, but it seems as if their greed for money has corrupted the country. I think these quotes speak for themselves. So there's an absolutely fantastic book by Sharon Rothbard, who's a Palestinian activist, and he writes a lot about how European modernism was kind of predicated on ideas that came from the colonies. So I'll read a quote of his from a book, White City, Black City. Le Corbusier, who willingly cooperated with colonialism and the Vichy regime, proved no less scandalous within his own political context. Le Corbusier used his first book, Toward a New Architecture from 1923, to suggest that modern architecture be applied as a replacement or vaccine against social revolution. So this is a common, many historians know that the way that Corb theorized architecture was a vaccine against social revolution, right? But I want to just really hammer down how horrendous the Vichy regime was and French occupation in Algeria actually was. So this is a photo of that from the 1930s in the town of Vichy, France, where the regime kind of that was its like spiritual center. And this is a photo of the Vichy regime's forced relocation of Algerians in northern Africa. And the reason that the Vichy regime was so interested in Algeria was specifically so that they could build the Trans-Sahara Railway into the hinterland of the continent. And it was to be built entirely by enslaved Algerian and Moroccan labor. So actually, when the French were in Algeria, they had these programs called the Model Village Program, where they would displace Algerians from their villages and then build up kind of utopian worker settlements for them, forced worker settlements for them. And if you look at these buildings, they look a lot like Le Corbusier's kind of modernist work. So yeah, it's a bit atrocious. And so the scholar Samia Heni, in her incredible book, The Architecture of Counter-Revolution, geographically mapped all of the camps, the concentration camps. Actually, in France, if you're a teacher, you'll get fired for calling it a concentration camp. You're supposed to call them recruitment camps. But so these concentration camps were the sites where roughly 3.5 million people were either killed or displaced during the entire French occupation of Algeria. And so coming back to Sharon Rothbard, he has this quote: "The link between European architecture and colonialism is not limited to the fact that European architects often planned in and for the colonies. Many of the components of modern architecture, especially those white elements such as the white wall, the brise-soleil, and the pergola, were imported to Europe from the colonies themselves, and more often than not through Le Corbusier's North African connection." So this is a haymaker of a statement. It's kind of saying that Le Corbusier has 5 main points that formed the main pillars of modern architecture, European modern architecture, came from the colonies. And so that's just one way that fascism and colonialism is deeply entrenched into the Western canon. And this is another quote of his: "The White House became an extension of the white ruler." So I'd like to bring it back to the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about how fascism is deeply, deeply embedded into the way that architecture is taught here. So on this screen, we're looking at 3 men: Robert A.M. Stern, who was the dean of the Yale School of Architecture for 18 years. We're looking at Philip Johnson, who is the first Pritzker Prize laureate from 1979. And we're looking at Peter Eisenman, the person who I would attribute responsibility to popularizing Casa del Fascio. So Peter Eisenman wrote a very, very prolific book called 10 Canonical Buildings, 1950 to 2000, that really since the early 2000s has been required reading. And one of the canonical buildings that he talks about is Casa del Fascio, House of the Fascists. And I'd like to read a quote of his. "To look at Terrani's work solely within its political context is to obscure the critical differences between his work and other work that fits more easily within these categories." So here we can clearly see that to Eisenman, you can separate a building's form from its function. So a building that's performing a fascist function can still be beautiful if it meets certain aesthetic kind of formalistic criteria. And so this is something that Leon Krier alongside Robert A.M. Stern repeat in their work about Albert Speer, who was Hitler's main architect. Krier said, "If a dictator takes up my ideas, the resulting town will survive the political system that commissioned it and stand as a social good. Besides, modernism rather than classicism has dominated the architecture of totalitarian regimes of both the left and the right." And Peter Eisenman, who is also a huge fan of Albert Speer, in an interview with Leon Krier, expressed his appreciation for him, saying, "I'm not interested in classicism versus modernism. That doesn't interest me in the least. I'm very fond of the Reich Chancellery. I think it's a fabulous plan. It's not rigid, classical, symmetrical." And it's very important not to leave out Mies van der Rohe from this conversation, who in the 1930s was actively trying to get work from the Nazi Third Reich. This is a classic sketch of his showing his kind of modernist slab with flags of swastikas in the foreground. But one thing that's always kind of stuck with me is that so many architects in the US have the wherewithal to say, you know, maybe a building for the Nazi regime is bad, is wrong. But you know, Mies van der Rohe later in his career, when he finds harbor in Chicago, he takes up work with the US federal government when it's actively engaged in Vietnam. It's internally it's squashing some of the most powerful Black liberation groups in the United States. So this project here is one of Mies's kind of quintessential canonical works, the Chicago Federal Center in the heart of Chicago. It was built at around the same time that the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley's administration, murders Fred Hampton, a 21-year-old chairman of the Black Panther Party. And it's also completed at the same time that the US is committing war crimes in Vietnam. So my question is, why do so many architects in the US, you know, condemn this, but not this? So this is a challenge to US empire that I think our work strives to achieve. And so now, last but not least, is Philip Johnson. To the left, I would say probably the most powerful architect in the United States in the 20th century, alongside Donald Trump, somebody that he was very close with. So if you've been to MoMA in New York, you will have recognized Philip Johnson's name on many gallery walls. The reason for that is because Philip Johnson founded the architecture department at MoMA with, he was a trust fund baby from Ohio. He used his inheritance to build a new wing in the gallery. And while at MoMA, he used the museum to shape perspective and discourse of architecture in the United States for his entire life. And during this time, not a single African-American architect was allowed to exhibit at MoMA. So it wasn't until 2015 that a Black architect showed their work at MoMA, several years after Philip Johnson had died. So this is a quote of Johnson's when he was in Poland in the 1930s. He says, "We saw Warsaw burn and Modlin being bombed. It was a stirring spectacle. Jews are a different breed of humanity, flitting about like locusts." So it's just coming to light in the mainstream how Philip Johnson spent time with the Nazi regime throughout the 1930s. And then so later in the 1940s, when he comes back to the US, he's actually receiving money from the Third Reich to further the fascist cause here. And so his first ever built project was a stage for a fascist demagogue from Detroit named Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest that was a rabid anti-Semite segregationist. And so Philip Johnson designed the podium for Father Coughlin in the 1940s for him to give a fascist speech. So that was Philip Johnson's first built work. And so my spiel against Philip Johnson will conclude with this quote from Mitch McEwen from the Philip Johnson Study Group. "One of the continued legacies of Philip Johnson is the continued default assumption that Europe is the location of architectural intelligence." So while Philip Johnson may have died in 2007, his legacy is deeply baked into the institutions that broadcast architectural ideas in the US. And again, it's Philip Johnson loves to be photographed in the center of very famous people. So his nickname for the next generation that he kind of cultivated was the kids. So the New York Five, Peter Eisenman, Michael Graves, Richard Meyer, Robert A.M. Stern, Zaha, they were connected. Frank Gehry, not so much. He went out of his way to disassociate. But Rem Koolhaas has also said some pretty sympathetic things about Philip Johnson that I think need to be called into question. And again, at the same time, while Philip Johnson is kind of grooming the next generation of power forces in the US architecture scene, he's also literally, I mean, there's documented examples of Philip Johnson kind of teaching Donald Trump. They're extremely close. And here we can see Rudy Giuliani on the left as well. So why study anti-fascist architecture? Why now? Pretty much because shit hasn't changed. So architecture aside, I think that there's a crisis in language right now where the word anti-fascism is kind of being usurped by actual fascists, and saying that fascists are positioning themselves on the side of anti-fascism to make themselves in the right light. And we saw this when Russia's full-scale invasion. It starts in 2014, but it becomes a full invasion in last February. And one of the first things that Putin did was start a Congress called the International Anti-Fascist Congress. And so it's, this is where language becomes like a war, a war in itself, right? And this is happening in the United States as well, where we have ultra far white supremacist groups that actually, they denounce Nazism and they denounce fascism, but at the same time they're fascists in their own right? And so the language of anti-fascism is being pushed and pulled in all of these different places, and I think it's very important that anti-fascists reclaim that language. And so here, coming back to architecture, we still see architects from the global West in the service of fascist dictators. So this is a model of Zaryadye Park in Moscow, completed a few years ago by Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. And if you haven't checked out Mikhail Moravsky's brilliant scholarship on this park and the role that it plays in Russian settler colonialism, I can't recommend his work enough. But this project has kind of become one of the epitomes of the Russian colonial project in this century. And so Elizabeth Diller was one of the architects on this project, and she's based in New York. And recently in an interview, she said something that I have no idea what it means, but she said, "I can't think of architecture as anything other than a performative art form." Whatever the hell that means. Performative for who? For fascists? That's up to you. So I think that this kind of surrealist, proto-socialist realist painting kind of captures the true kind of essence of that park. And so, this Diller, Scofidio, they're not the only ones. Wolf-Prix was commissioned to design an opera hall in Crimea after 2014, and after the full-scale invasion, he went on record saying that I'm not going to stop designing this. And not to focus just on Eastern Europe, this is happening everywhere. Bjarke Ingels, who for many years has been the kind of wonder boy of Western architects, he has absolutely no qualms working for Jair Bolsonaro, the murderer of indigenous peoples in Brazil, who also designs New York City Police Department precincts in the Bronx, in the lowest income neighborhood in the city. So that's what I have to say about that. And so I'm wrapping up my presentation now, but so I think that I lambasted a lot of people that deserve lambasting, but I want to end on a kind of optimistic note and shed light on an anti-fascist architect. So one of the chapters in our book is going to cover Kiyoshi Kuramaya, who was a civil rights, anti-war, gay liberation, and HIV/AIDS activist based in Philadelphia. He was a student of Buckminster Fuller, an architecture student, but he left architecture to design solidarity networks. So this is an anti-Vietnam War protest slogan that he designed that was distributed in newspapers around the country. He was also part of a militant Philadelphia-based anti-racist, anti-capitalist LGBTQ group called the Gay Liberation Front. He designed their propaganda. And in the 1990s, when he was actually diagnosed with HIV himself, he started a project called the Critical Path Project, which was a 24-hour hotline for Philadelphians living with HIV to reach out for help and support. And so I'm going to conclude with an excerpt from our book that is forthcoming about anti-fascist architecture. Born into a Japanese concentration camp in Wyoming, Kiyoshi Kuramaya studied architecture and co-authored books with Buckminster Fuller. Instead of designing buildings, Kuramaya built solidarity networks. He dedicated his life to the civil rights movement and fighting the AIDS pandemic. The People with AIDS Coalition was a mutual aid network for low-income sexual minorities of color he co-founded, eventually serving as a delegate to the Black Panther Party's Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in 1969. In 1990, he started the Critical Path Project, a 24-hour telephone hotline and website for people living with HIV and AIDS in Greater Philadelphia. That's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We will have some time for Q&A and discussion after the presentations. We do encourage everyone to type their questions in the chat. There are a couple of questions already, and we will answer them in a minute. But now I will pass my words to Andrew. Andrew.
Thank you so much, Dasha and Vlada and Dan and Anela for just being fantastic comrades in this. Dan and I have been working on this project for better or worse now for it's going on 2 years, right? It's over a year now, and it's been a really interesting sort of process because both of us are kind of approaching this from different perspectives and also sort of different, let's say, like disciplinary lineages, right? To one extent, Dan's really approaching this from the realm of history, and I'm sort of approaching this from the kind of realm of architectural theory, as well as critical theory, and to an extent criticism, but also through design, which is a part of what we're also trying to do in this, which is not just to, let's say, identify the issues themselves, but also produce work in spite of them, right? And perhaps where we don't have kind of a solid conceptual foundation for something, even though I would say we do have that sometimes, we sort of make through it, right? And I think that's something that is probably more common for the folks that are in this room, which is this idea of doing it yourself, and sort of building the things that don't exist to serve the things that, serve you and the sort of needs of your community. So there's a lot of that, I think, inherent in this. And so I'll only add to what Dan said is that I don't think we're necessarily approaching this from the kind of typical perch of like American academia. I think in many ways, if that's where it maybe started by virtue of our kind of positionality in it, we certainly wanted to sort of leave that sort of arena and be in the streets where it needs to be, which is a huge part of, I think, what we're trying to do. So thank you for that awesome presentation, Dan. So let me go really quickly and start sharing my screen here. We could kind of go from there. So, one thing that I think is important for everybody is to listen to good music. And one of the things that I think has been important for me for my entire life, and particularly my entire adult life, getting into activists, has always been sort of finding that relative art form that can keep you going when, like, you don't necessarily want to read another book, and you can continue doing the work. And so This is a playlist that I've been producing over the last, really, it's 20 years worth of music that's influenced me, but over the last year and a half, there are a lot of, I think, songs there that, and global songs that really kind of touch upon that question of art as a revolutionary form. I think it's so easy for us to think about amazing music as a form of anti-fascism, as a sort of central part of anti-fascism. And all I would want is for architecture to be a little bit more like music in that case. And so feel free to, screen grab the QR code there and enjoy on your end. Yeah, I'll definitely put a link to the playlist. Don't worry, but you can just screen grab the QR code and it'll go straight to the Spotify playlist. So like I said, Dan and I are approaching this in a couple different ways. And so for me, I think like a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is textual and visual. I'm very interested in ideas. And so we kind of always are working through this and trying to sort of set a foundation for some of the sort of ideas that emerge from other ones. And this is just an amazing quote from Mumia Abu-Jamal, the former Black Panther Peabody Award-winning journalist in Philadelphia, who has been in prison since 1980 for a crime that he says he did not commit. He was on death row until a few years ago. If you know anything about Philadelphia always, but particularly in the 1980s, was that it had a kind of full-scale military assault on any form of Black liberation and any type of sort of radical activism. And this quote, I think, is really interesting. It speaks to a lot of things, right? Number one, it's pretty easy to get a gun in the United States. And number two, maybe what we have to say has a little bit more power than we think. And you can see that specifically now with several states in the United States now moving towards kind of educational gag orders that are restricting freedom of speech in academic environments. So for example, this lecture that we're giving now in Florida, we could potentially be defunded in a department if we were to give that, and some student's parent could sue us potentially, right? So, and I'm from Florida, so originally, and so that's definitely a piece of this puzzle. So the first thing I'm going to start with is actually a project that been working on for the better part of about 10 years. And it sort of emerges from a collaboration with a very, very close comrade of mine, Julia Sedlak, who I believe is here today. And it sort of speaks to what's at stake, I think, in the realm of architectural theory. When we say architectural theory, I think it's important to contextualize it a little bit. Let's say, like in a sort of Western sense, but also in a much more global sense. It's a bit anachronistic to call something like Vitruvius or Palladio Alberti like this idea of like a theorist, right? In many ways, these manifestos and guidebooks operate differently, right? When we think about architectural theory, of course, I'm so sorry to drink some water. What we're thinking about is this sort of history of like Russian constructivism and the suggestion that writing is a form of architecture as well. And so when we think about architectural theory in this context, we're really starting from this sort of powerful history that suggests that, we could kind of write ourselves out of capitalism if we have the sort of imagination and the knowledge and the solidarity, right? Of course, what happens is this kind of massive recuperation of that radical inkling of architectural theory that's really emerging from not only like utopian socialists and Marxists in their own right from all around Europe, but also, of course, the work of Russian constructivism. And so this diagram is more of a kind of recent sort of idea that Julia and I we're sort of pushing over the last few years. And I think it's just updated a little bit now to sort of include this project. And so in terms of American architectural theory after modernism, which is really, I would say, the kind of heyday of architectural theory, the introduction of critical theory into the discipline of architecture, in particular the scholarship around architecture and the ideation around architecture, is crucial. And so what you first have is this wave of kind of critical takes on architecture, or what the historian K. Michael is always referred to kind of as critical architecture. And critical architecture is something that was practiced by, of course, Peter Eisenman and several of that kind of crew that Dan was showing from the Philip Johnson archives, right? And what's interesting to me about this idea of critical architecture is that all of these isms exist on a spectrum, right? And this kind of XY spectrum goes in two directions, right? It goes from the performative to the formal, and then the conformist to the activist, right? And each of these points, I think, are quite important in understanding the sort of combination, right? The corner points of the two. So in the bottom right-hand corner, for me, this kind of notion of the critical or critical architecture has always been not just about formalism, but it's always been about kind of conforming, meaning that it sort of operates in the status quo, as well as suggests that architecture is best serving the world when it is separate from the world, right? And so I think in many ways, if something doesn't actively sort of challenge the status quo, then it is obviously conforming to it. Several years later, and this is something that is basically the basis of a lot of the 2000s and the 2010s, an update to this emerges that is referred to as projective architecture. And that's coming from people like Sarah Whiting, Bob Somel, that the best way to sort of, put this is that they're sort of interested in the world, but only if the world has something to offer them. They're interested in rearranging the world, not necessarily changing the world, right? And so I always refer to them as a kind of reformist project. And I think is most close to how like white liberals in the United States operate politically. On the other end of this spectrum, on the sort of corner point, you have this other form of kind of performative activism. And performative activism, I don't think I have to define too much. You probably see people, engage in performative activism all the time, whether it's about, posting like a black square, or perhaps, never going far enough in their sort of critique of the world. And then finally, this idea of formal activism, which is one that understands that abolition and activism are sort of central, and you have to politicize your formal project, right? Understanding that is effectively like what changes the sort of approach to architecture. And just, very quickly to sort of move through this, you can see the types of things that maybe we consider to be conformalist, right? From the Eisenmanian project on the one hand, through the sort of typical Patrick Schumacher project of parametricism, and particularly his 2 volumes of the Autopoiesis of Architecture. That's like 2,000 pages of junk, and not like junk space in an interesting sense, but like junk as like a piece of shit. Suggesting that our relationship to technology, and particularly parametric tools in architecture, can effectively flatten all of the important things that we consider to be central in our lives for the building of architecture, and could sort of take it on as a project. These are just sort of approaches and then updates, right, in terms of the critical. The projective, I think, is one that, again, I was very much schooled in this. And what I think is important to understand in terms of projective architecture is that it rearranges the world around itself. So when you see it, you can see elements of the world there. It's not like the work of Schumacher or Zaha or the work of Eisenman that is in a way very estranged from the world. But here you can see some, these are actually, I think, quite beautiful projects of architects that I actually really love. But in terms of like their approach to the world, they're basically rearranging the world around itself, from fashion architecture tastes project in, I believe that's in Essex. And then, Andrew Kovacs's project for Coachella to work like Junya Ishigami's work. You have other versions of, like, I would say, performative activism. And I think it's really funny that we have Eisenman in there, but hear me out. Performative activism, I think, is one that is very interested in slogans and perhaps a kind of neoliberal approach to the world. So it performs or co-opts a political message, either within or outside the world around you. So it's kind of like a very opportunistic form of architecture. So, on the left-hand side here in the United States, we have this, kind of like, let's say, over narrativized history of the rural studio out in rural Alabama, that basically, let's say, says that, like, we should create charitable architectural infrastructures for people that don't have them, right? They don't necessarily or have ever necessarily critiqued the sort of realm of capitalism, but have made this into kind of institutionalized, workshop project for students in Auburn University, and then produce these projects for poor rural folks in Alabama that are generally African-American. You also have the work of people like David Adjaye and the sort of African-American museum in Washington, D.C. that is, by its own right, an incredibly powerful building. And yet, I think a sort of critique of this work has always been like, well, why couldn't Black Americans potentially build this or design this, right? And then, of course, the work of Peter Eisenman in Berlin, and the sort of Holocaust Memorial, the Museum of Murdered Jews, which historically has not been a very popular project. And to Eisenman, the main point of this was to sort of depoliticize and de-aestheticize the history of the Holocaust from it. And so it becomes this odd vanity project where it sort of performs through activism. And then I think you have this other sort of powerful realm of formal activism, and here I think are kind of like three very radically different examples of that. On the left-hand side, you have Mass Design's museum to the sort of terror lynching in the United States that happened throughout the Jim Crow era and before, during, and after slavery. And that project itself is incredibly aestheticized, in that it uses these sort of markers hanging to really hammer home the reality of this sort of terrorism, right? In the sort of middle point, you have the work of Freddie Mamani Silvestre and this sort of constant hyper-indigeneity that he brings to this neo-Andean architecture that is only possible through the election of the first indigenous president of Bolivia in the mid-2000s and socialist president, who legalizes the production of coca leaf, which is predominantly farmed and cultivated by the indigenous Aymaran population in Bolivia. And they are able to effectively become like a new middle class. And then the work of Jermaine Barnes at the end, which is about this notion of identity, and specifically the sort of objectification of that identity, but also the sort of aestheticization of power. So these are three very different projects that sort of engage that. I think Angela Davis really kind of hits it out of the park with this, like almost everything she says, but I always want architecture to sort of be this, right? The idea that progressive art can assist people in their kind of, let's say, trajectory towards emancipation, I think is amazing. I just really, really think that architecture could be that. However, I think we have to decouple it from a lot of the things that don't let it be that, right? And so the first thing that I think is key is to this concept of recuperation. And in our project, we're sort of very seriously against this notion of recuperation. Recuperation for us is a business ontology, to borrow from Mark Fisher. And a business ontology is effectively something that props up capitalism, right? So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that props up capitalism. Recuperation is basically the co-option of language. And you probably have seen it around you in every single place that you've lived, whether you live in the US, Europe, the global South, Asia, etc. This sort of recuperation approach is absolutely one that is actually quite profitable for people, right? So to an extent, you have stuff like this, right? Like, you know, the sort of pigs putting pride stuff on their cars to show how much they care. You have stuff like this in Washington, D.C., the Black Lives Matter Plaza, where, you know, you get the city during the summer of 2020 sort of allowing for this large mural to sort of take place, but also in the same token, people being brutalized by police on top of that mural. You can get this cute shirt as soon as you like. I mean, you know, I like the sentiment, but, you know, at the same time, it's a little weird. And then you have projects like this, which are perhaps the worst type of architectural projects that exist, the rebranding and recuperation of certain forms of language, and then sort of shoving it back down the sort of communities that are sort of affected by it. This is a project by Jeannie Gang in Chicago called the Polis Station, not the police station, but the Polis Station. And, you know, they're using, you know, the word polis to let you know that they know a little bit about history. They know a little bit about sort of ancient history. And here it's a really kind of ridiculous project. If you know anything about the history of Chicago, you understand the over-policing of Black communities in the South Side of Chicago. And so this project was made for the first Chicago Architecture Biennial by Jeannie Gang Studio. And in it basically tried to make the police station a community center, and to kind of show that, you know what, this is what you need. You need the police embedded in your neighborhoods right next to where you are all the time, and you can play basketball together and everyone's happy, right? This is also, and it's here in Portland, but you have firms that from one slide to the other change their mission statement. So you have folks throwing in the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion into these slides, and then speaking about how important it is to support the communities affected by like racism, and then they work on a police station themselves, right? And so in like perhaps one of the whitest neighborhoods whitest neighborhoods and cities near Portland, and obviously one that will actively be sort of oppressing the sort of people that their diversity, equity, inclusion statement is supposed to support. The other point that Dan and I are quite interested in is this notion of chameleonism. And I think most folks know what a chameleon is, right? It's this, I mean, I don't try to use metaphor all the time, but it's fun. A chameleon is a reptile that basically can change its kind of look based on what it's touching and basically to fit in. So it's a defense mechanism, right? I think chameleonism in architecture is something much more nefarious, right? And so I want to introduce these two, again, business ontologies that I think are really typical in architectural chameleonism. And the first one is this notion of a variation product, which is this idea that you can sell the same product with different variations, right? And the more you do that, the perhaps more of the profit share, or the more of the market share you can basically have. I think Philip Johnson's work is specifically indebted to this business ontology, specifically through the notion of variation. And I don't think I'm probably not the first person to call him a chameleon because of his history of architecture, which I'll show you in a second. The second point is the idea of the generic product. And really a generic product is, it's like generic drug versus brand name drug, right? This definition is literally taken from the generic drug, brand name drug thing. And it basically is the same exact drug, just sold by someone for more because of the brand. And so the generic product is one that sort of fits in and hides, amongst other things. And it tries to sometimes emulate the other product, for the purposes of like the person buying it, saying like, well, it's the same color, does the same thing, it's $3 cheaper, let's take it, right? And so I think it's important to like believe when people show you who they are, I think you should believe them. And so this is an important essay that Philip Johnson wrote in the 40s about the glass house, the one that he designed. But what's interesting about it is that he explains where he sort of like steals every single idea. I don't know if he uses the word steal in this, but he absolutely speaks of influence in a kind of very kind of liberal way. He's able to sort of push and pull different things. What's maybe the most interesting part about this little essay that was published is that he admits to sort of stealing Mies van der Rohe's not yet completed Farnsworth House concept for this, which, as you know, these two projects are very, very similar in some ways, very different in others. And in other ways is there's no way to think about Mies in the United States without his sort of sponsorship by Philip Johnson, right, to sort of come over. But of course, when you think about the chameleon of Philip Johnson, you think about the fact that, I don't know why, but these fascists always live to be 100 fucking years old. And so he's able to change his architecture from every single era, every decade, right? From the high modern to the sort of business as usual postmodern, all the way to like some weird formalism in like the 2000s. And so this kind of chameleonism, I think, is preached very, very often in architecture school because of its kind of marketability and sort of ability to be thought of in a kind of business sense. I think the other form of chameleonism, right, like I mentioned, is the generic, right? And when we think of the generic, we have to obviously think of Koolhaas. And you know, it lays it out plainly in SML-XL, suggesting that it doesn't matter, like context doesn't matter, right? So if context doesn't matter, like what's the point of an architectural project, right? And in many ways, I think he updates this in 2014 to further, like, you know, kind of dig himself into a hole with this slide from the Venice Biennale of Architecture, where he's suggesting that, you know, that all of this notion of absorbing modernity in a kind of universalizing architectural sense has occurred. And I think these are incredible examples of just generic architecture. What's also great is that it's kind of like a little self-deprecating because he also includes his building, right, in the Netherlands, right? That's the Rotterdam building from OMA. And so it just, you know, again, it's kind of hammering home this thing. And Koolhaas has always kind of done that, where, you know, you introduce yourself into the project to, like, you know, publicize yourself, because why wouldn't you? That's a sort of good business acumen, right? Of course, I wouldn't call OMA a very good business model. One of the last points I think that's like super key is this notion of mutual aid. And what you know, I'm just going to throw it out, like this notion of capitalist functionalism. I don't think there's any way to separate the notion of function out, you know, kind of away from capitalism. And so, in terms of this idea of mutual aid functionalism, anti-fascist programming, I want to posit an idea that anti-fascist architecture combines aesthetics and programming. It doesn't necessarily flatten them into one thing, but it allows them to be much more comfortable together than apart, which is exactly what current kind of architectural practice in the United States really pushes, is that there is a separation between what's being done and the kind of performance or aesthetics of the building. Sometimes there's maybe a little bit more of a kind of relationship, but for the most part, that separation, I think, is itself a kind of business ontology as well. And so I think that you can combine aesthetics and programming through a practice like mutual aid, which is, it's a necessary material practice that sort of creates a solution to something that capitalism does to us, right? It's a very anarchist approach to the world, right? It doesn't wait for a state to do a thing for you, right? I really think that it's kind of key to think about mutual aid when you're doing that. And you know, you could look at history of architecture and perhaps anachronistically suggest that there are some very specific kind of mutual aid projects that existed, from Narcomfin, right, and rethinking the notion of the sort of the sort of kitchen as this kind of like individualist space for invisible labor by women, and then the idea of a sort of collective kitchen, right? Where you know, that's one example of like using a kind of mutual aid concept in a programming sense to change the way architecture operates. But it's also something like this, right? Where, you know, in the United States in the 1960s, we did not have the sort of free breakfast programs for children that we maybe, that we definitely should have had. And so the Black Panther Party all across the United States implemented these free breakfast programs for all kids. And that forced the hand of several US governments to actually then implement their own free breakfast programs in perpetuity. Of course, there are many places and states now that are starting to take that away because of their own kind of like austerity and fascist politics that are sort of occurring. When you think about, I think the kind of aesthetics of mutual aid, there's no way to think about that without like Keith Haring and the sort of work of something like a pink triangle and the relationship between the kind of aesthetics and protest. So what does that look like in terms of a potential, let's say, spatial correlation, right? I think also think about the community schools in the Zapatista autonomous regions in Chiapas, right, in southern Mexico, where if you ever look at the type of, like, say, fascist violence against the Zapatistas autonomous regions, they almost always start at the community schools, because they know, like, whoever is sort of enacting this violence from sort of state-led or sort of paramilitary-led sort of war knows that education is dangerous for the status quo, right? And so I think for me as a Latin American, I've obviously always looked to the Zapatistas as like an incredible, powerful example of how to sort of enact mutual aid in spite of the sort of grip, right, that capitalism has on you. But it also looks like this, like, what is the space of social media? And so here in the US, we have like a mutual aid hub that is, you know, fairly dense in terms of what you might need, from food resources to any form of networks. And here is just like in Portland, all the different kind of formats of this. And they're everything from sort of medical mutual aid hubs to things like free fridges and pantries, as well as like syringe drops. These things for me are all architectural and necessary. And they're also some of the most highly politicized things in the United States. And that leads me just to some of my work, but particularly with harm reduction and working closely with incredible drug reform activists and harm reductionists to develop this sort of mobile drug injection site and facility that activists could effectively just, like, pay for shipping, and then can do these sort of projects where this form of architecture becomes kind of central in their educational mission, but also shows that another way is possible other than like letting people die on the streets, right? And so here are just some images of that project throughout the years. I'm just going to quickly go through the altered anti-fascist architecture that Dan and I worked on. This is a project that I started to design back in 2021, and brought Dan on later on into the project to specifically work on this kind of like survey of anti-fascist architecture. And then it just turned into this love fest where we both are constantly trying to update this project. But we kept asking a lot of the same questions that we just kind of spoke about. And it kind of led us to this, huge repository of some projects that we know, the project that and some projects that perhaps are a little less known. And they became these sort of saints, these candles, right, that we could worship on this kind of altered anti-fascist architecture. We also work closely with graphic designers to produce a very straightforward typeface that looks to the sort of concept of collectivism to suggest that maybe there's a way to produce anti-fascist typefaces. And this is a typeface that has no lower cases, but does not necessarily look very good on its own, like in terms of letters. It looks great when it's put together, just like good collective activism. And so here's an example of some of the sort of projects, and of course one of our favorites, the work of Boris Kingelis out of the Congo, and his incredible postmodern visions of a post-apartheid Africa. Free breakfast program, like we mentioned. This is just some images of me working on this project, some studies, some color studies. We're very serious about color here. I will not get totally into that today. I'm happy to talk to you about that, my odd obsession, and just kind of studying these things. And then here's the project installed at the Bellevue Art Museum in November of 2021 with the candles and the aforementioned sort of studies. And then the last thing I'm going to finish with is a little bit of the work that Dan and I have been sort of trying to popularize. And maybe this is me asking you to start thinking about doing some of this, which is, it's, you know, you can do a quick sort of history and sort of rescuing of a potential figure that was incredible and amazing in terms of anti-fascist approaches in the world. And I want to encourage all of you to try to do that, but make the project about today and really consider some kind of update. So we did this project in Chicago in the summer called the Almighty Church of Abolition, where we were invited to basically redo a gallery. And what we did is focus it entirely on the work of Alphonse Laurentić, who was himself a sort of European anti-fascist architect, artist, and fighter that went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War and fought against Franco's side. And his claim to fame is that on the left-hand side, you see this. He produced, him and his comrades produced these psychotechnic torture chambers that were used for captured Francoists and fascists. And they built these in the bottom, in the basement of captured churches. And what it was a way to sort of aesthetically torture and physically torture someone with modern art. Because and Dan is really good at talking about this, but basically fascists have always and always hate modern art. And there was this sort of concept that maybe the aesthetics of it, there's something there to it. And so on the right-hand side is just kind of like our update to that. And we remade this project in a basement, technically, in Chicago, which, if you know anything about Chicago, it is basically like, it's a 20-foot platform downtown that the entire city is built above. And so we're in this sort of public pedestrian way. And Dan and I sort of decoupled some of these aesthetic pieces and reassembled them inside. And used this sort of color palettes that Laurentić himself was using in these projects, as well as some of the sort of lighting techniques, and then reassembling some of the formal things, reconsidering like what specifically it means to sort of exalt a project of prison, right? Of carceration. And we decided to not do that, and instead, you know, sort of liberate this thing from its kind of incarceration model or its incarceration logic, and instead make it a space for, you know, like a party or something, or not just discussion around anti-fascism, but also a place for collective joy. And so here are a couple of issues there. You could see a couple of images. We also had direct ways to donate to the Chicago Bond Fund. So if someone was as inclined to say like, well, you know, I'm here, you know, perhaps, you know, my $200 or $300 donation will get someone home tonight. That's another part of this. You know, we also tried to really just aestheticize every portion of this, all the way to like using the sort of ceiling tile as the kind of main text grid, and then showing a kind of partially revamped 9 points for prison abolition. So this is my kind of like last slide. I think that there are a lot of things that we can do in terms of architecture and kind of moving forward. And I recommend always asking, even the sort of architectural ideas that you have, like, what do they have to do with capitalism? Also, what can I do in spite of that, right? That perhaps doesn't use a tool of capitalism to sort of reify capitalism, right? So definitely recommend that. And I love this meme. This could very well be my fridge because there is some soy milk there. And I am vegan. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that wonderful presentation. Absolutely loved the last slide. And now for our final presentation, we're going to go to Aniela, and then we're going to open up the floor for comments, questions, and hopefully a discussion with all of you wonderful people. So on to you.
Okay, I'm going to be a full boomer here, unfortunately. Please let me know if you can see the screen like in full or not, because this is not my laptop and I'm struggling. I think this is okay. Is it?
This works. Yeah, this is perfect.
Perfect. So welcome everyone. As always, I am going to talk about ex-Yugoslavian anti-fascist monuments, as that is kind of like what I crave the most as a person coming from Southeastern Europe, specifically Bosnia. And Dan has already said this, I mean, Andrew as well, but Dan specifically, there is this, as soon as you study in the West, as soon as you study architecture in the West, you will most definitely only get architecture presented to you as a Western concept with Western values. It's always going to be about the same fucking fathers of modernism that were absolute fucking garbage and did nothing. And then there's this vast body of beautiful architecture, which actually has a social connotation to it. And unfortunately, we don't talk about that. So here, definitely bringing back the XU vibes to this. So a thing which is crucial, in my opinion, is to always re-examine for whom an architecture was made and what it meant back then, the same way what it means right now. And I'm really glad that Andrew has put such a strong emphasis on capitalism in contemporary times and on violence, because I think that a lot of the discourse which we have about ex-Yugoslavian monuments is absolutely redundant and does not pair up with the immense responsibility which it bears in itself. So just in terms of terminology, what we even define as ex-Yugoslavian anti-fascist monuments, that is already something which could take a small eternity to explain, because unlike popular opinions, the reality of Yugoslavia and then the actual lived reality of people was very, very different. And there were a lot of discrepancies. So who has the authority to call what an ex-Yugoslavian monument in terms of anti-fascism? They also have not always been this grand structures, which, to quote a Belgian photographer, alien spaceships in the Western Balkans. Instead, they had this entire history of morphing from small little plagues that people who have actually lost someone and survived the Second World War, where they have put them up, and then only later in the 60s has the state of Yugoslavia acknowledged that it should actually commemorate the lost soldiers specifically, and not necessarily the victims. So that's how I come to this. Whose architecture is this even? And even more so now, where Yugoslavia has fallen apart 30 years ago. Whose is it? Is it in terms of jurisdictions? Obviously, if a monument from those times is within the state borders of a country, the country is responsible for it. But ultimately, it entirely defies the nature of these socialist monuments, because they were always meant to be collective. Yet, obviously, because of the mere concept of nation states, which obviously we have to thank France for, our grand best colonizer, this entire context of violence is very often taken away, because it's just the way it is and we cannot do anything for it. And whom do we even commemorate is another problematic part. And throughout my presentation, I'm going to show you 3 photographs which I've taken myself at Garavica Memorial Park, which is one of the most significant pieces of anti-fascist architecture in Bosnia. And no one no one practically cares. And we don't like, there is this huge discourse whether we should actually even have this or maybe abolish it, because the way that ethno-nationalist narratives have entered the space of ex-Yugoslavian anti-fascist architecture is sincerely surreal and very, very painful, because it is emblematic of the struggles which have not been solved through the slogan of brotherhood and unity. Instead of actively assessing, reassessing, and dismantling the grand narratives which have been spun for hundreds of years, it was just, we're one, we're united, and we're all equal. Nevertheless, we were never equal. So while as I would love for this question to remain solely in the realm of history, it is perpetually relevant, and it is most likely going to haunt us even more so long as there's like at least one little stone left of this very precious anti-fascist architecture. But nevertheless, one thing I hope that we all can agree on is that first and foremost, this kind of architecture is meant to reinforce the cult of glory and pride. Most of all, these commemorations, the entire aspect of learning, since Yugoslavia did have an educational program where people from various republics, Yugoslavia II, which was the socialist Despotarije in Bosnian, people from all different republics which go to other ones and then be educated about the grand fights which their predecessors have fought, and how fantastic the army was, what the sacrifices were, how terrible Nazis were, which is absolutely true. Nevertheless, the discourse about how cruel Ustaše and Chetnice were is mostly lost. But we never should forget that this was also a huge scale project of self-identification, and Yugoslavia as such, being a socialist country, was very much dependent on the idea of sacrifice. And we can see the sacrifice not only in terms of its architecture, commemorative practices, but also in terms of social welfare, the conditions of work, and the lived realities of the working class. So while they are beautiful and they do matter a lot, especially in contemporary times, still I think it's important to add another layer to their meaning besides just being commemorative, but it is about glory and pride are severely hegemonic means. And I'm also very sick and tired of Yugoslavia being represented as this super cute, wholesome place where everything went right, which unfortunately is also people do believe for the Soviet Union. And we should have at least that much criticality to reassess both of these systems for the potential, for the very often brutal regimes, which they actually also were. Now, talking about brutal regimes, this is the first picture of Garavica Memorial Park, and it's a piece by Bogdan Bogdanovic, which was actually kicked off. It is located in Bihać, which is a border city between Bosnia and Croatia. And I would just love to point your attention to one thing. While it's the monument, it's a memorial park, so it has 13 columns, which are all unique, made from the same material. Still, what does this architecture mean? It is definitely a reminder of time, and most of these architectural pieces have also been obviously placed in the spaces, in the landscapes where the most brutal fights were fought against Chetnice, Ustaše, and Nazis. Nevertheless, one of the things which absolutely denies and defies all of the meaning is this passage here, which you can see in the woods. This is the passage which has been used by migrating people to go from Bosnia to Croatia, where they have been violently pushed back, where they have lost all of their belongings, potentially even family members, friends, people with whom they've been on the move for years. And I think it's very emblematic of how complicit all of us are. But I'll come to that later. But I just think that while as these landscapes are very beautiful in an aesthetic kind of way, not just, and they're severely fetishized by Westerners, I think it's more than sad that we do not talk about the juxtaposition of something which we're supposed to be proud about, and then just forget that on this path right here, hundreds of people have most likely died, and they will never come back because of the brutal policies which we have, and we're all accountable for them because we profit off of this violent system, and we just don't care as a collective. And while there obviously is a lot of support, especially in the Balkan route, still our state and our government does not care about this part here, and especially not about this. And we need to actively be reassessing what does this even mean, because it's present. Architecture will never solely change society. We need to change as well, and then emphasize our architecture to actually as a foreground, and or at least like as the landscape of having these conversations and paradigm shifts, as Westerners call it. Now, the only reason why these, when I think of ex-Yugoslavia as such, and especially all of the material remnants which we have, it's mostly about just one rupture after another, because while it didn't last for all too long, at least the socialist version of Yugoslavia, since its predecessor was a kingdom. All I think about is ruptures, and the only reason why we have these is because of the Second World War. But then they had a specific connotation and meaning back then, which obviously has evolved slightly throughout the years, especially through these entire movements of people visiting commemorative practices, all in the name of great thanks to Tito, because he was our Lord and Savior. Not questioning, obviously, any hegemonic relationships, not the gender of it, not the violence, not the crimes committed. Absolutely not. It was just about gratitude. And on the other hand, then we have the closer rupture to us, which was the fall of Yugoslavia in the 90s with the Yugoslavian wars. So now we have this heritage, and it's given the fall of Yugoslavia. Now we have two post-war legacies, out of neither one of them is remotely close to being done, because unfortunately, architecture is a great means for historical revisionism, and the way that this architecture is also being instrumentalized is absolutely under-talked. The way that this architecture serves as the backdrop for playing oppression Olympics, who has died, which ethnic group, minority or majority has that, what are the numbers, who assess these numbers, and so on and so on. It's always about this push, who has suffered the most, and things didn't change ever since that war, and especially not since the fall of Yugoslavia, which has just reignited these already very present ethno-nationalist, separatist tendencies. And obviously, given that entire context, Westerners could not obviously hold it together, but to just start to intellectualize that to a great extent. We have had many different waves of that. Nevertheless, I would just love to focus on two. The first wave was about it was just about extremes. On the one hand, Yugoslavia would either be this idealized project, which was meant to fail because of the West, because of capitalism, which on the one hand absolutely is true. But there was this intellectualization of people's experiences, and that has even further acknowledged the existence and pushed for the existence of Yugo nostalgia, where no critique is ever allowed, where whomever did not like it was just a pure fascist. There is this particular character of just oversimplifying a project which was so incredibly complex, not to even speak about the non-aligned movement, which would then definitely break the time span, which most likely already kind of low-key breaking. But anyway, like Yugoslavia was a multifaceted project, and just to put up the dichotomy of Yugo nostalgia or just absolute hatred for Yugoslavia, which was as well used to just show how capitalism is great, how the West has always been more righteous in its existence, and this is what people get for believing that socialism could work. And absolutely a massive amount of this just lives destroyed, people that displaced, family ties utterly destroyed, the concept of neighborhood absolutely destroyed, just so many sacrifices solely so someone from the West could say, this is what you get for believing that things could actually change. Nevertheless, after a few decades, as always, academia has reinvented itself, where I want to also applaud specific academics for having disrupted that, and who have realized that it is a lot more than just a binary. And the way that we also critically analyze this architecture also does speak to how do we actually talk about it, how do people identify with it, how does this immense knowledge, like what is the responsibility of the knowledge production side. And well, I do applaud that, and they have done a great work in terms of dismantling binaries, dichotomies, and all of that. The problem is that we still use the part of terminology from the 60s, because most of these iconic monuments were created in the 60s. We use this terminology after taking into context the juxtaposed level of the violence and destruction of the wars in the 90s to explain contemporary phenomena which were caused by that. So we are linguistically seeing we're still back in the second post-war period, which doesn't allow us to break through, and it feels like a perpetual reliving of Yugoslavia and of those times where we are just put in a particular box of not being neither able to divulge that, neither being able to actually pull through, because we keep using terminology from past times to reassess the contemporary. Obviously, only people of privilege, meaning that working class people and anyone who's of a particular religious group does not have any audacity to speak about this. So it's not all, it never was about so much about brotherhood and unity, and it even further isn't when we are trying to speak about that which was most collectively accessible, and it's exactly these monuments, which is incredibly sad in itself. Now, this picture could actually be just like the entire presentation, because it feels like all of these layers are just, they cannot be exhausted, because it really depends on what was the official narrative, what did people actually feel, and how do they feel right now? Does anyone care about this? And I'm going to come right now to the aspect of care and decay very quickly, but something which I find is also not talked about enough, and Dan has been pointing that out very much in this presentation, is just the hegemonic relationships. Who builds this actually? Who funds this? And what does it mean? Who, even if we speak about like care right now, who pays for that? Is it taxpayers' money? Is it particular people who are being targeted to pay for this? In Bosnia, I can tell you that if anything is done with monuments, it's mostly self-organized collectives of people that just care for this, that potentially love to take a walk there, and they just don't want to see swastikas and Ustasha signs, or a hammer and sickle, of course, as well, to some is very traumatic, which is absolutely understandable. So if there's any intervention, it is done by the people. But ultimately, crucial thing when we speak about this is how do we weaponize this heritage for own identity politics to absolve ourselves from their responsibilities? Because as just think of the first picture, we have migrating people passing by, violent pushbacks, them just having to try for a game without any support, without anything, juxtaposed with this huge glory and pride for human rights against fascism does not really match up. And given that we have this vast body of materialized anti-fascism, it really makes me question, is that enough? And obviously it doesn't, but we need to be speaking about why exactly it isn't. Just because we have anti-fascist architecture does not mean we're an anti-fascist folk. And I think that just the necessity of us to continuously reassess ourselves, to face the world as it is, to stop thinking we have this is our past, and build our identity on that is just not enough. While it does give me joy to know that a lot of people, my people, whatever that means, have actively fought fascism, and we should be grateful to them, because if it weren't for them, we would live under someone else's boot. Nevertheless, just having been raised with that, having read about them, speaking their language amongst other things, having visited these places, loving these places, is just not enough. And we see that even like if it's only about our region, and then not to think in transnational connotations, like how our anti-fascism just isn't present, instead of having these bonds of and structures of care and solidarity with the global north, or with Ukraine, for example, right now, we just remain in this little box of we have our own little problems, that is our responsibility to do, we have our monuments to take care about, and that's it. And it just defies the beauty and the value of anti-fascism as such. On the other hand, who cares? And should we care? And what if we don't care? And how far does this legacy go? Because to me, as a very concerned leftist, these monuments are everything, because they are one of the very few things which fascists didn't manage to eradicate during the wars. Nevertheless, how can we, like, who has the audacity and who has the right to project their own visions onto you should care or you should not, and this is how we should behave with these monuments? And how does that discourse reflect in public space? My personal favorite example of that is graffiti, because as Western hegemonic relationships with architecture have taught us in many ways, graffiti are evil, we shouldn't do this. The youth specifically is not allowed to have any critical voice, and especially not on monuments which we do not fucking care about, because if we did care about them, they wouldn't look like this, right? If we see this very neoliberal practice of which Andrew has beautifully pointed out, just do it yourself. If you care about it, then that's great. But this Yugoslavian heritage has given us cultural capital to show to the West back in those days and even now that there is something beneath this very often perceived backwardness, dirtiness, and barbarism, which the Balkans are being defined as such even nowadays. So it's this destigmatization through an architectural means, which was finally good enough for the West, and to lose that obviously does scare a lot of people. Nevertheless, I think it's quite beautiful to see that people are actually using the space. And it's really like because we do live in a capitalist society, which is entirely fucked up. I think it's relevant to also be speaking about ownership, like who owns this actually. It was collective good. Now it's in the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Bihać. But is it the city council? Is it the community who owns this? Is it the youth that actually goes there, that leaves these material traces of their beliefs, of love proclamations, of compliments? These upper parts are saying Amina is the most beautiful, and then beneath that Sara is the most beautiful. And since I visited this monument myself, I was just mesmerized by all of these messages. Some were incredibly political, and some was absolutely nostalgic. Some was just kill all fascists. There were hammers and sickles. There were Ustasha signs. There were Chetnice signs. There were just profound love proclamations. There were various dates which meant something to the people who actually were there. So ultimately, is this the new value? And just like I said in the beginning of the talk, there's this fixation of terminology, which is from back then, from the 60s, and we are now in 2022, and we see that there is this huge discrepancy. And I believe it's time to just reassess that the politics of life have been completely lost ever since, because of the traumatic disruptive events of the 90s. But these monuments were never meant to be of a Western character where you go there to mourn. Instead, people were happy to go there. People had picnics there, despite the fact that 100,000, however many people, were literally buried beneath the soil. It was always meant as a place of gathering and collectiveness. And it's very wild. I mean, it's actually not, but I just love how Westerners love to point out how patina, especially coming from a background of conservation and restoration theory, Westerners love to speak about patina on French and Italian palaces, to give them extra value so they can become the next desirable project for some capitalist owners next to gentrify a fantasy. While as when it's about political iconography of Eastern European architecture, then it becomes problematic, then it's untamable, and it brings back this very orientalized vision of an entire region. While as this is most likely the only and best resistance which we even have. And I would really love to question whether decay as such, I mean, who defines decay as well? Unfortunately, Bosnia does go along with the Western canon of what is all right, what is not, how to keep monuments. But for what their decay, what decay means to them, is absolute resistance to us. The fact that people still go there gives them more value than any single action of cleaning the stones, of anything. It's this very puristic, anti-human vision which we are projecting onto this architecture, instead of just embracing it as a continuously shifting space for people, which it should fucking be, but it's not. And I'm almost done, I pinky promise. The way that we project so much of our own identity onto these monuments really does testify how fragile our anti-fascism is. Our anti-fascism is mostly built on this heritage, which is intangible because we do not know the fights which these people have fought. Most of the ties have been completely lost because even those who have been successors to those who have fought and potentially survived, or just who have been saved by the grace of either God or Tito, we've also lost them as well. So what is our anti-fascism really stems from these history books, from the pamphlets, from the slogan of brotherhood and unity. And it's just that, because in contemporary times, we see that there is a lack, that there is an entire lack. And I would really love for us to just reunite with this. And maybe that is the future, that people just going to these places, using them as a beautiful backdrop for whatever they want to do, will maybe make us realize that our savior is not the West, and it never will be the West, but it's just us standing in solidarity with each other, getting to know each other, and then using that and creating these transnational bonds of love, affection, care, that will actually give us back this anti-fascist core, which we apparently also adore and love. And just judging by this talk, maybe our legacy did expire, but it's not. I want to believe that it's not too late to reignite this fire, to just come to terms with what has happened, which is a project which is basically impossible for the Balkans, since there's continuously something. It's never boring. But I think we really need to be speaking more broadly and more inclusively, most of all, about what is legacy, what does materialized legacy mean, and why does materialized legacy have so much precedence over emotional legacy, of a legacy which is just purely funded on trauma, on sadness, on despair, because there's a lot of, like, the same way that there are these dichotomies between these Yugo-nostalgics and then those who hated Yugoslavia. It's just like right now, like, either take it full or just leave it apart, instead of just allowing for us to just see, what does this mean? Do we want this? Do we not? How do we go with this? Instead of patronizing our poor little monuments, I would really love to see this paradigm shift anytime soon, in which, like, we stop being so paternalistic towards what do we do with our monuments, as if there's some things which have no agency, while as these monuments unfortunately do have a lot more agency and backbone than all of us together as the folk who's living right now in the borders of ex-Yugoslavia. Instead, we really need to consider, like, what do we do with ourselves? How, like, what can we do so we can take hold of this grand heritage? And what can we do with it in the future? How can we reconnect with this? How do we rediscover ourselves? How do we invent ourselves? Because tradition, ultimately, like identity, is just merely constructed. Just as a fun fact, in terms of politics and life, and just about reinventing ourselves, this beautiful monument has been built by Bogdan Bogdanovic, and he's infamous for his monuments being spaces where people have sex. And while as a lot of Westerners would just start screaming, like, for example, Foster, Ilya Korbs, and all of those other fascists, like, how dare they? To Bogdanovic and so many other ex-Yugoslavian architects, it was the most beautiful thing, which you could tell them about their architecture. The people actually felt like it's a safe space, a place of life and joy and resilience and resistance. So maybe that message should have come across a bit earlier, but I think it's very relevant to think, like, what actions do we do there? What can we do there? What do we feel safe? So just know that this beautiful monument, which is unfortunately right now very problematic, does serve as a backdrop for photo shootings and for sex, for youth. So yeah, that's that. I hope that this information alone has given you a bit of joy.
Thank you, Nell. It's really hard to after this final thought, it's really hard to say something.
That was beautiful, yeah.
We're so grateful to you guys. It's been wow. We've been thinking and trying resistant to comment all the time and asking questions, and we really want to open the floor to those great people who are still with us on Saturday, watching this. Please unmute yourself if you want to jump in with a comment or with a question. You can also type a question or a comment in the chat and we can read it out if you don't want to speak on video. There are a couple of links in the chat that Dan has shared for 2 texts, and they lead to Soniach. And we want to give a quick shout out to this media, which is a great media convened by Ukrainian allies, and they try to amplify the voices and visions from Ukraine and those of Ukraine allies and neighbors. It's a great media resource. We highly recommend it.
But yeah, if there are no questions just yet, if everyone's still thinking, if everyone's hard at thought for a question, if our speakers wanted to exchange any thoughts, because I know it's quite, these conversations can be quite fruitful for like the 3 of you as well, just because there are such contrasting narratives, yet we're still talking about conceptually the same thing. So if you want to jump in while people are thinking, that would also be lovely if you have something to say to each other.
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely kick in right now. Dan, I love you. And I was just I'm just like the way you bash all of these fathers of modernism is beyond beautiful. But I really loved how you started off with a very subjective experience, because I as well, when I've just read about Le Corbusier, I was like, he was a rapist and he was a racist. So I do not see this grandeur everyone was speaking about. And I think just the way that a lot of our, especially in Germany, the way that his exactly the project which you have represented has been put into words, like he just wanted to make this grand project on the coastline, and it was meant for the people to actually collaborate with each other, and yes, it was for wealthy people mostly, but still there were these specific parts which would be publicly accessible, and these parts which should be publicly accessible were basically for bringing things there like food and water and so on, because this was supposed to be a semi-self-sustainable community, which was absolutely gate kept. So I just really love how like the actual, like the way that this gets so depoliticized and sanitizedly put into words, where technically just looking at it could be a good description, but then to just willingly disregard the political layer of absolutely racist violence is quite the move. So I was really happy that you pointed this out, because I remember while I was going through my own experience of just undoing all of the damage from my university, that it's just like the way that this has, the historical revisionism really has no boundaries, and I'm just still so shocked, like how no one also, how rarely anyone calls it out, and how even in 2022, when we talk to even younger architecture students who are like more daring than we were in our times, how it's still so, it's almost like a death sentence to say Corbusier was a fascist, which he was amongst many others. So really grateful for this shift in dynamics, because we really fucking need it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Anoa. Yeah, this was amazing. This is just what we needed. And I think that to commend your presentation towards the end, I think Andrew and I gave a kind of helicopter view of the problematics in history and theory, but you're focusing in on one particular project. That one particular project for me, and your analysis of it is incredible, because it pierces through so many questions, and how messy anti-fascism is, legacy, and it brings up it's so, that one project is just like, it pierces through all of these different questions that are super important that to address when we talk about anti-fascist architecture, because it's you know, it's a messy history, It's a beautiful history, but it's also a very messy history. And I think your analysis just like completely just covers that beautifully. So really.
We have a question from Maxwell, actually, and we'll just ask to unmute you.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I thought it was a really lovely evening. I think what comes across, across the three, is this idea of like the work of fascism is also this idea of absence. I think to like Andrew's project for these safe spaces for drug injection, you know, the idea that what doesn't exist is also very much a part of the project, and there's this role in revealing that, which I think Anela you did very well. I think it is really great. It's sort of like this quiet hidden force, you know. They're these kind of monumental edifices and the kind of glorification as well, but there's really like this explicit role in silencing, which I think was came across really well. So thank you all very much. That was super fun. I mean, as much fun as you can have talking about these things. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxwell.
Yeah, I think that point's interesting, because I think for a lot of folks, you know, all of our kind of like, you know, westernized, neoliberal, pseudo-fascist sort of governments, regardless of what they give us in terms of welfare, I think the thing that they do the best, right, is sort of, you know, manufacturing consent, right, in the term of Noam Chomsky. And so I think when I hear about the sort of invisibility of certain radical things, or perhaps a lack of visibility of certain radical things, you know, I always think about the point of like, you know, like gravity, right? Like it's this kind of like, you know, ever-present force, but it's like very easy to break from it. But it, you know, it does bring you back down the ground all the time, but it's very easy to break from it, even for like a second. And I think about all kind of like our social practices that exist in spite of these things, right? So you brought up safe shape, and so, you know, abstinence only models to sort of public drug use would be happy to hide, right, like what's actually happening on the street. And so our approach and our work to that specific project is not to hide, right, and to instead to sort of highlight and to keep safe, right, the person using the drug. And so this kind of like shift of it, right, this visibility obviously is key, but that's also kind of like a recuperation, what's it called, black hole, right, where folks are sort of really keen, particularly like businesses, really keen on representation, but not reparation, right? And so I think on the end of that, when I think about visibility, I think about existing in spite of it, right? In spite of capitalism, in spite of the sort of way that we're kind of oppressed by it, whether it's, you know, culturally, intellectually, physically, materially. And in each of those instances, there are these sort of radical practices that humans have already always done anyways. And so my suggestion is like, architecture absolutely is also that. There are instances of it throughout history where it was used as a sort of radical thing. However, predominantly, right, it's only ever been used as the kind of second line of defense of settler colonialism, right? You kill, then you build. And so on our end, it's this other suggestion that like, sure, the messy history makes it kind of hard to identify the things, but it's available and it's practical to engage folks like Anela, like your history of these, or your suggestion of like re-understanding of these anti-fascist monuments, and also the complexity of like the relationship with like Yugo nostalgia and Tito's nostalgia, right? That's like popularized by people like Zizek and stuff. Like there's certainly room for these kind of criticisms, and not this binary thinking of like, well, if you're critical of something that's on the sort of leftist history, then you're obviously not left, right? And I think that's why Dan and I really, really push the concept of anti-fascism, or the moniker of anti-fascism, because we want to make sure that as an umbrella term, it's welcoming, right? Eugene Debs and Emma Goldman had this great conversation back in the, like almost 100 years ago, where, Goldman to an extent is critical of Debs' socialism, herself being an anarchist. And so, within it, Debs was like, we want this kind of like stateless reality, right? And I think that for us, and I think it's an American thing, to be super frank, a Usonian thing, if you will, because America's is much more than the United States, of course, that we're hopeful that that moniker can serve a kind of productive space for this work. It's so kind of like big, and it's also so politicized, right? Not just in terms of the sort of European problem, but also here in the United States is like, if you have that term in like a in your profile, it's a very simple way to kind of connect the dot for some sort of surveillance. And so it's a bad word here in the United States. And I mean, I love bad words. So yeah, thanks for that point.
I'm just going to read out very quickly a comment from Tristan, who put it in a chat because unfortunately they don't have a mic. But I'm just going to read some of it out, and then there's a question for the speakers and anyone else. So Tristan's from San Francisco, which like cities such as Portland, Detroit, Baltimore have been denigrated by political right as a failed city. Political right's historical solution has been hyper-securitization, more funds for police departments whose budgets now dwarf budgets of state armies. And meanwhile, our most famous architects have shown themselves time and time again to be out of touch and outright complicit with the grossly rich and grossly repressive architects' work for police departments, Putin and his cronies, Bolsonaro, etc. So I'm wondering if there is a point when the architect as a professional / business entity becomes outdated or useless. And I'm wondering who can be architect, who should be an architect. Does the distinction between architects and non-architects needs to change? And that's very interesting. Thank you for that point, because I was also wondering, like, how do we go away from the kind of concept of architect as God? Like, how do we kind of give away the power from, this one entity that is above everyone else, and how do we kind of diffuse it? And it's very on point with like what we do at PPV, talking about power verticals too. So thank you for that wonderful point. Anyone?
I mean, I certainly have ideas, but I just took up space. Feel free to jump in. I'll say it after.
I'll just jump in really quickly. Andrea, I think that this question really ties into your reframing of capitalist functionalism. And yeah, I mean, I think that when we talk about so Andrew and I, like in the survey that we're starting to collect, we have the free breakfast program, we have Kiyoshi Karamaya's work, we have we have cybernetic architecture from Alandes, Chile. So things that aren't physical, but are anti-fascist in their architecture, they're kind of immaterial architecture. But so I don't think that this is like a super straightforward to your question, but I think that Andrew and I, when we analyze a building, we place a lot of emphasis on function as opposed to formalism. And so that's going to be like a huge, this question that you brought up, Tristan, is great because it's going to be a huge part of the book. But Andrew, do you want to riff on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a central question, and specifically here in the States, right? Because I'd say the difference between the European architect and the Usonian architect is that there is just much more history to deal with in Europe than there is necessarily here in the United States. And so right now we're sort of going through, and I'm speaking about this not just as like me in this project with Dan, but also as me as an educator and an administrator, like considering this in terms of the future of architecture, right? And so I think there's like 2 points that I have to stress. One is architecture hasn't and will always be redefined to be things that it is currently not, or to be things that it currently wasn't. And that's just really kind of like the way we identify. And so I think in terms of historiography, right, that is something that has occurred after modernism more than anything. But if you really want to get anachronistic, you can take it all the way back to the sort of the first couple of lines in Vitruvius's 10 books, which says architecture is everything, right? So if architecture is everything from the beginning, then we have no problem here, right? Because the way we think about and practice architecture has always been engaging everything. Obviously, we know that's not totally true. And I am certainly like skeptical of this like 1960s US approach to like considering architecture as a kind of like generalist practice, because ultimately I think that takes us away, number one, from like what perhaps we could be doing collectively against this basic reality that capital begets architecture. And instead maybe bringing it back to these sort of maybe like 20th century socialist ideas that like need begets architecture, right? So these are things that are very simple to bring down. Now, to the point though, right, in terms of what we're trying to suggest is, I think in and of itself, abolition is a really interesting approach to architecture because it acts as a kind of subtraction of certain capitalist tools. And the way abolition works is that it's skeptical of a certain thing. It asks to abolish that thing, and that thing gets chipped away, right? So as a prison abolitionist, I believe that there should be no prisons, right? And that that also includes, you know, in like the worst sort of crimes that you could imagine being committed. I think that these are all systematically related to much bigger issues that we're not dealing with. And the notion of prison is not an adequate response, right? The notion of the punitive is not an adequate response to these things, right? They are just like, you know, hoping that drug users are hidden away in a corner and not necessarily like dealing with the fundamental issue of perhaps like curbing public drug use through decarceration, decriminalization, and healthcare. So that's one part. So abolition, I think, acts as a kind of form of subtraction, which I think works very well with another really important thing happening today that neoliberals as well as radicals are speaking of, which is the concept of degrowth, right? Which is this idea that maybe we should never build, a moratorium on building construction, right? To Charlotte Barth's work, right? So if you think about that, this concept of like, well, if the architect's not going to build, are they even doing architecture anymore? I would say that like our concept of abolition of certain functions of capitalist functionalism go hand in hand with the kind of material abolition or moratorium on building construction as like an approach to sustainability. So I wonder though, right, if we can kind of like, you know, recouple concepts of degrowth in a material sense with much more kind of radical economic and political ideas. Because currently speaking, it's absolutely, because it comes from, you know, like not coming from Harvard, but it's, let's say, popularized by a professor that was at Harvard, right? You get this like, you know, buzzword of degrowth now being kind of shared throughout the United States, and you're seeing degrowth, and you know, in its kind of simplest sense, it's just saying reuse, right? And reuse was the word before degrowth, right? And it was the word that was pushed in a kind of sustainability narrative for all of us. And it's not wrong, it's just politically meaningless. And that's what happens with recuperation, right? When you recuperate something that is radical, it becomes completely meaningless, right? Especially when you use it as a kind of approach. So what I would probably say is like the future of architecture is definitely building less, which probably means that there needs to be less of us, right? Which also means that there needs to be less architecture schools, less architecture professors like myself, right? And so it becomes really, really tricky because when we're all part of the fucking Ponzi scheme, that is capitalism throughout the West, you start to realize that all you're doing is producing the next sucker under you, whether that's for educational purposes and needing people to apply to schools, or whether that's looking for people to take terrible internships for very little money or no money, right? So there's that. Now, unionization, that's a curveball that I'm very excited for in the United States. Like, those things are powerful, but ultimately I don't think that they're powerful enough on their own to change the trajectory of architecture, because all unionization, for example, is saying here is, well, we need to be unionized to build the police station, you know? And where the problem isn't just the fact that you're getting oppressed as a worker, the problem is also the fact that the police station is being built. And that's the only money that you can use to pay you as a fucking worker. So that sort of cycle needs to fundamentally change. And whether or not it needs to change in terms of just our kind of like production model is neither here nor there. So that's why we think you need to repoliticize architecture, because it will then, you stop at that like one point, degrowth or whatever, and then you repoliticize it to include a more radical political imagination and potential. And I think that that is what ultimately will lead to change, not just the act itself.
Thank you, Andrew. We were also, of course, thinking about the context we're from and what is anti-fascist architecture in the context of brutal destruction of built environment.
And if I can interrupt quickly, it goes really well with your concept of mutual aid, Andrew, what you brought up, like what Dasha is going to talk about.
Yeah, and we were thinking like what is and there were so many points throughout all of your presentations that resonated a lot, especially about the do-it-yourself and mutual aid and what it means for us. And of course, we want to highlight those initiatives that are grassroots initiatives of activists who are rebuilding the houses destroyed by the Russian missiles right now at this very moment. And they're doing it without any architectural planning or any architectural training. They're just self-organizing and going to rebuild what has been destroyed. We are sharing a link to the support page where there is a list of such organizations, but I will briefly share the screen and show what they basically do. Their Instagram pages, so they just go to the regions, ask people what they need, and then fundraise and rebuild with their own hands. And to us, we think this is a prime example of anti-fascist architecture, which is happening in Ukraine at this very moment. And we do encourage everyone, if you could, to donate to any of them. They're well-trusted friends who are all in Ukraine now. And I think that will be a point for us to finish off.